This podcast has been produced on the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples. From 2RPH and the Wicking Trust, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Kaldor. I'm recording this whilst walking on Norfolk Island and currently on a tour of the cemetery.
Now, that mound you see outside the fence, that's Murderer's Mound. This mound just out here. And there's 12 people buried there.
Norfolk Island is a place that is breathtakingly beautiful, but also stark, with a dark history steeped in death, dying and tragedy. It is also an island full of life, nature and a spirit of rebellion. I can't think of a more fitting place to introduce Series 2 of Passing Thoughts, especially as Passing Thoughts is about demystifying death and dying, and it's also about celebrating life and learning to appreciate every moment we have here on Earth. If you haven't listened to Series 1, there is a rich collection of episodes waiting for you, featuring generous guests whose stories are varied, heartfelt and deeply real. Look it up on whatever podcast provider you use. In Series 2, we aim to build on that foundation with even more compelling and diverse conversations, filled with laughter, tears and authenticity. To launch Series 2, Barbara Sullivan speaks with Sam McConkey, one of the founders of Bear Funerals. Sam, along with his co-founder Kaldor, are flipping the way our final journey is conducted.
If we look at an established funeral business, what are the elements, if you break down the elements, that give you your point of difference as a business?
So I'd say there's two parts to it. The first part is the role of the funeral parlour. And so traditionally, the funeral parlour is both the place that you would arrange the funeral, and in most cases it would be the place, the venue where you would host the funeral and bring people to. And on both sides of that equation, we feel that's quite an unnatural pairing. As a place to arrange a funeral, you're by definition out of your comfort zone. You're asked to make decisions over a short period of time in a setting in which you're unfamiliar. And there's almost this, not intentional, but sort of subconscious power dynamic in that you're entering into a funeral director's comfort zone and out of yours. And ultimately, it's quite an unnatural place to arrange a funeral. Equally, no one's favorite place is a funeral parlor. And so it never quite made sense to us why you would go and have your final celebration of life at a funeral parlor right after Mary had her celebration of life, right after Jenny had her celebration of life. And so the first point of difference, if you will, at the meta level was let's remove the idea of the funeral parlor entirely and create a sort of digital first experience with plenty of humans supporting it that allows you to arrange the funeral from home. And then by virtue of not having any funeral parlor or any horse in the race, if you will, we can hold the event anywhere. Pub, RSL, your backyard, wherever, it makes no difference to us. Whereas most funeral directors' business models are orientated towards, we have the service in our facility, and that's kind of it. So that's kind of part one. Part two is, as you would well know, death is a very elongated journey that has many, many components to it. And the traditional way of doing things is that you go to a lawyer for this part, and then you go to a funeral director for this part, and then you go to an estate administrator for this part, and then you go and find a grief counsellor for this part. And all of those search and selection journeys are themselves quite traumatic. And it never made sense to us why there wasn't a sort of more continuous journey, particularly for the next of kin and the immediate family going through that. By virtue of doing it digital first, we've been able to create this journey for the individual planning for their own end of life, right through to the next of kin who's going through their own grief and administration of a loved one's loss, without them needing to constantly go and find the next company or the next person that they trust. And so over time, the vision for Bear is that we become this comprehensive single place that you can go through end of life, from planning right through to administration, without needing to constantly go and find the different parts of the journey. Whereas the traditional funeral model is very much, we do the funeral and then we wish you the best. We want to play a much larger role than that. None of this technology is here to replace the human as much as to enhance the human. You spending an hour on the phone to a funeral arranger going through coffin selections is actually probably not that helpful for you. You're better off having that time to yourself to be able to do that at your own pace. Same is true on some of the legal side, where it probably doesn't make sense to fill out a form with somebody if we can make that simple. What it then means is that we can use all of our time to support in only the places that a human can. Friday afternoon, because that was the time you always used to go for a walk with your husband that you've now lost, like, let's call you and make sure you're doing okay in that time. And we can afford to do that because all of the administrative complexity we've taken out of the process so that we can just let humans be humans and interact at the human level. And so, yes, there's more comfort in arranging things and managing things digitally, but equally, we've got just as many people. We just want them to be focused on the parts of the loss journey that only really humans can help with. And we can only do that if we can digitize a bunch of the other administrative parts of the journey. We still try and localize as best we can. And so if you're calling from Perth, you'll speak with somebody from Perth. If you're calling from Sydney, you'll speak with somebody from Sydney. But we try to not remove formality, but just try to make the connection as authentic as we can. And so if your style is that, you don't need to dress differently because you're in a funeral parlor, like dress respectfully, but dress how you would normally live and work. And then the same is hopefully true on the family side, where you're going to be paired with somebody. We're the experts in doing this, but we think the best way for us to do this is for us to just kind of get rid of this formality and tradition around the process, connect as if we're having a cuppa on the couch. And like literally that's what happens a lot of the time, is like we're on our desk having a cup of tea, you're on your couch having a cup of tea. It may take 15 minutes because you want to just get this over and done with, in which case, fine, like that's what we're here to do. You may want to spend 3 hours because you've got no one else to talk to, and now's the right time for you to go and relive those memories of the person you lost. Fine, let's do that too. Let's get another cup of tea. And so we try to kind of meet you where you're at, being respectful, but knowing that grief and loss looks very different to different people. And our job is to kind of tailor our way of communicating so that the person always feels comfortable, whether that's 3 hours over cups of tea or a super transactional, I just want to get this done. Whatever works for you works for us. Kayla and I have been friends since our early 20s, and a sort of tenet of that was always, so we thought about things similarly, and over time we always wanted to build something together. The way life worked out, it just so happened that we went through funeral experiences at roughly the same time, which sort of looked roughly the same in the way that they like felt to us. And so there was kind of a friendship with the desire to do something together, meets a personal circumstance with the subject matter meaningful enough that we both kind of wanted to leave our jobs and pursue it. And sort of one thing led to the other, and before you knew it, we were in the funeral industry together and haven't looked back since. And so it wasn't quite as linear as perhaps one thing came first, but certainly we've been looking for something to do together for a long time, and it just took a while for us to find the thing that we both felt motivated about enough to jump into bed and do it together.
So, in fact, you'd gone through that before you actually started the business, which makes it, I guess, kick off much more easily, much more seamlessly, and you knew what the other was like.
I'd say having a co-founder is kind of like getting married, but the best mates part pre-kids and the best mate part post-kids is very different. And I would say the startup is kind of like having a child in a marriage, where you know the person, you've grown close over the years, and all of a sudden there's another thing that sort of sits between you. And instead of holding each other's hand, you're holding each other's hand plus the hand of a 2-year-old. So we knew about each other, like we had a great relationship beforehand. And so that part of the sort of founder journey was established. But certainly like life looks different with your best mate after a startup versus before the startup. And so we kind of had to, relearn elements of the relationship where there was a third party involved. And I think on the other side, we both look back and say it made us better friends because there was purpose behind the friendship more so than just the individuals behind the friendship. But it's a constant process of learning and relearning as Bear becomes different, as we become different as humans.
Well, you had a shared experience, as you say, where you both suffered very hard losses, personal losses, and which brought you up close and personal to the funeral industry as you tried to work through all of that. Was it a generational thing, your reaction to the way the funeral industry handled your particular circumstances?
I'd say there's a few different layers to this, in the sense that as we talk about it now, there's a level of reflection and processing that's happened that allows us to sort of abstract from our personal experience and kind of understand the landscape. At the time, we were sort of reacting in sort of a more like instinctual sort of human response in a kind of like a carnivore type way. I think over sort of time with the ability to reflect, what we've realized is that no fault of its own, the funeral industry was built to serve a very particular generational need. Most funeral directors now were built 50, 60 years ago, and they were built to service a particular generation, the silent generation or the greatest generation before that. And there was a number of defining characteristics of that generation. They were traditionally quite religious, conservative, and very localized in that they lived, grew up and died often in their same local community. And so it made total sense for the funeral industry to evolve as this sort of largely traditional funeral parlor-based community initiative. Over decades and decades and generations, a lot of that's changed. And if you look at sort of the primary influence on death now, a lot of those things aren't true anymore. And particularly as baby boomers become the primary influence in those decisions, sort of a lot of those things are less true for that generation as the generation before that and before that again. And so when we sort of look back with the benefit of time, we're able to say, hey, actually, like the experience we had, we're a different generation now to the folks going through it. And so what would it look like if you were to build the death experience for this new generation of consumer? And reality is it's quite a different experience. And so Bear was sort of born with this idea of, we're not funeral directors, we're not from the industry. We can kind of think through this problem as former consumers and on first principles and design a funeral experience for the modern Australian, not necessarily the Australian that lived 2 generations ago.
So you haven't set out to be disruptors of an industry necessarily. What you've set out to do is say what is appropriate for this generation, what is appropriate now in Australia, particularly in Australia, because we're increasingly less traditional.
I think disruptor is a term that's used too loosely. Effectively, what we're trying to do is think through, what does the consumer want now? What do they want 5 years from now? And let's design that from scratch. It just so happens that as a consequence of doing that, you come up with a way of working in a business model that's different from the incumbent way of doing things. And so you're labeled a disruptor. It's not necessarily that we set out with that in mind, as much as the exhaust of what we were building meant that the traditional ways of doing things was disrupted, and hence we've become the funeral industry disruptor.
Well, the Bear approach, from what you've been saying, is clearly very personal. And the fact that you and Kale are the front faces of the business, and very much the front faces of the business, and you inculcate the same requirement for communicating with customers in your staff. You must have lots of stories. People must trust you to share their stories with you. How do you store those stories in your head? Does it shape the decisions you make in business?
In short, yes, in lots of different ways. Our kind of DNA has always been like, how do we go the extra mile here? And so like a few examples I can think of, we used to have this, we have prepaid customers, which is where you prepay for funeral long in advance. And early days, I remember we had this guy who was very poor and was paying a prepaid off fortnightly because his hope was to live long enough and have enough money every paycheck or every pension to buy a box, the next DVD in the box set of the X-Files. And he had no one to talk to about it. And I didn't know any of this was happening, by the way. This was without our knowledge. And it just so happened that, and we hire for people who are like this. We don't expect people to do this every time. But we found out a couple of years into the journey that the consultant that he spoke with at the time had bought him a box set of all the X-Files for Christmas one year, and had been calling him every Friday, every week for a year to catch up on. So he had somebody to talk to about the X-Files, the latest X-Files episode. And like that person has since gone, but I'm quite sure that was one of the highlights of the last year or two of his life, having somebody to talk to about this thing that he'd grown to love. And so we try to take these stories and one, let it define like the types of people we hire and the types of culture we create. And it's not going to be that every time, but there's always something that you can do to make people feel heard, make people feel special. Particularly in loss, one of the hardest parts is when the funeral ends and everyone goes back to their lives, you're left deeply lonely. And that's actually where grief often hits. And so we think a lot about how do we play a role at that part of the journey. And then we try to, in all of our meetings, all of our sort of company decisions, we bring customers in, we have them talk to us, we make sure everybody, even if they're not in a customer-facing team, spends time talking to customers. We get out there and just make sure that as we get bigger and bigger, we don't lose sight of what Bear started with, what made us great to begin with and like what sets us apart, which is just this complete obsession around the customer journey.
I think you've got about 50,000 customers, and you've had a very good opportunity to do your own market research if you're on the trends that are happening. And are you noticing there are particular trends in what people want? I mean, for example, more people wanting prepaid, more people wanting wraparound services. Is there a generational difference? Are the younger people coming through now? You've got Gen X and millennials making decisions about their parents.
I'd say the meta trends are certainly one, like personalization over tradition. And so, what personalization looks like can be very different from one person to the other. The sort of stereotypical is this extravagant celebration of life that's colors and party and anti-funeral almost. That's not true for everybody, but certainly the idea of a funeral has to look a certain way is starting to make way for a funeral can be whatever I want it to be, and I want it to reflect my life rather than reflect a tradition that's been cast upon me. And so that is certainly the overall trend. I would say there's another trend around not necessarily prepaying your own funeral, but generationally, we've been terrible at talking about death, and frankly, we still are. But the biggest shift that needs to happen within death is that the decision maker needs to change. And so forever, the decision maker has been those left behind, often the eldest child, often the eldest daughter, actually. And more often than not, that person is wildly unprepared for a death, even when that person was very clearly entering the end of their life. One of the core things that we want to see at Bear is the decision maker change from the person left behind to the individual themselves. In some cases, that's going to look like a completely prepaid, pre-planned funeral with a eulogy pre-written to be read out. In other cases, it's a simple set of instructions around what I want to do. In either case, it's really sad actually at Bear. We see every day the tragedy of families splitting up through disagreements around the funeral, the estate, the management of dad, mum's finances. And so even if it's as simple as protecting the fabric of the family left behind by just having the basic instructions in place, like that is in itself the biggest shift that needs to happen within death. We're seeing it more and more. We're being more and more open to the conversation, but it's off a very low base. And so there's a long way to go in that trend.
And I imagine that with more blended families now, that those issues are multiplied.
More complex families, more complex estates, more of a diversity around what a funeral could look like, and with sort of a broader spectrum of outputs is a broader range of possible issues. And so it's not getting any better. And so if more so than ever before, the need to play a role in your own end of life is crucial. Otherwise, the downstream impact of that is super significant. And the sad part is the last thing Dad would have wanted is for his family to split up because of his death. And so the biggest gift you can leave your kids often, or your loved ones or your friends and family, is to put those plans in place, because you're not here for it, but I can assure you that it happens far more often than we'd like. And very simple decisions put in writing can save a ton of family agony down the track.
Having found yourselves delivering services that are probably the most sensitive of any business you could be involved in, how has it affected your own views about death and dying? This business started with your own experience of it, which shaped what you've been doing for the last X number of years. Are you desensitized in any way?
It's been interesting, the personal shift. We originally started Bear because we went through sort of customer experiences, if you will, post a funeral, and wanted to solve the funeral experience. Obviously, by virtue of being front and center facing death every day, and increasingly the tragic circumstances of that, it makes you, I think, more and more, you value life more and more. It's hard not to when you stare it in the face. I think there's always a risk that at a certain scale, early days, it was really easy because I was the one and Kay was the one arranging these funerals and directly engaging with families. And it's hard to ever desensitize yourself, I think, when you're on the phone to a mother who's lost a son. No matter how many times you've had that conversation, it gets you every time. You have to develop ways to cope, and the only way you can be effective in your job if you can separate someone's grief from your own grief. But there's no way to desensitize you from that. We've probably been wanting to look more and more over time is that as we've gotten much, much bigger and we are speaking with families less and less and with employees more and more, how do we make sure that we're still deeply driven by the customer need? And that's why this sort of idea of bringing customers into every decision that we make is so important, because we now have a multiple 100-person team, which means that we're just less and less directly interacting with families. Through that period, Kayla and I have also both had kids. There's nothing quite like dealing with hundred thousands of funerals a month to make you really soak up those moments. And everyone's got the type of loss that gets the most. For me, it's obviously young kids, and every time you see that, you can't help but want to log off early and go and hug your kid a little bit extra tight that night, because no amount of time in the industry, and any funeral director will tell you this, no amount of time in the industry can desensitize you to just the sheer pain of loss and the impact that should have on the way you live your life.
So have you ever needed therapy through this, or is your family your therapist?
A little of both. We have our own grief counsellors at Bear. They both support our families and they support our employees, because grief shows up differently for each person. And for me, it shows up differently. So my family is my therapy, certainly, but you kind of got to be open about it. Like, the worst thing you can do is bottle it all up, think that you're going to be right and have no outlet. Different people need different outlets. For some, you need a professional counsellor or psychologist to be that outlet. Others find more impact actually in their teams. And so, you work super closely with somebody, that they've gone through the same thing as you did in the last 7 days. Like, that's actually quite a helpful support system at times. And so Kayla and myself are quite a good support system to each other and our families more broadly. And so I've not needed so much professional support as I've leaned on the team's Kale family to kind of be an outlet to confide in, knowing that sort of keeping it in is the worst of all possible outcomes.
One of the characteristics of the traditional funeral business is that it's much more transactional. It is a business that people have not taken that intense personal approach that Bear has. So employees of traditional funeral homes have been able to stand back and remove themselves a little bit from the tragedy of situations.
To a degree, there's easier ways to earn a living than be a funeral director. And so most people that are choosing to be a funeral director are actually very empathetic, people-driven humans that genuinely want to make an impact. And that's true for Bear, it's true for most other funeral directors. I think it's more the nature of the business model that they're required to operate within that makes it feel more transactional. We don't necessarily think that there's funeral directors out there who are less empathetic, as much as they're constrained by this business model, which makes it more transactional.
So do you talk about your own mortality with your family and with Kale?
We don't shy away from the conversation. It's, I think there's this kind of spectrum of like death literacy, if you will, and there are those that really enjoy the topic and find fulfillment in the topic and find that it makes their life richer, and there are those who look at it as more of a necessary part of planning, no matter how healthy, old, sick, well that you are. I'd say we're somewhere in the middle on that spectrum, where like you can't help but not think about your own mortality when you're doing the job that we are doing. And we've certainly done the work to make sure that we don't leave anyone in the circumstance that we try actively to avoid. We aren't necessarily like every day talking about our own mortality with each other, because we're sort of living in a business that you can't avoid that topic anyway. And so we find a middle ground between, you still got to be light and enjoy life and not let it consume you, because you do it for 70 hours a week. And so when we get out and go to the park, we try to change the topic, but certainly it is what it is at a day-to-day level, and we're very comfortable with that. Early days in our friendship, maybe because we were 21 and indestructible at 21, but as the years have gone on and the wrinkles have gotten deeper, it's far more a comfortable topic for us.
You've got everything in place and you've had the conversations with your wife and with your loved ones. You must hear stories of a lot of last conversations from your customers, and also the ones that they wish they'd had and never did have. What do you think is the most important conversation for people to have before they die?
I'm not directly answering your question, but I will get there in a roundabout way. I think funerals are this weird thing in many ways, in that you're bringing together all of the people who loved you and all of the people you loved for a period of time where you're all sharing deeply your relationship, respect, love, moments, memories with each other, but you're not there for it. And so I often think that although it's not one conversation necessarily, it's always struck me as a little odd that we wait until death for all of these conversations, all these moments, all of these feelings to be shared, when all of that stuff can happen at any point in time. And obviously the extreme example is living waits, where people hold a funeral while they're still alive. I think that's awesome, by the way, and we've had a few of them, but we've been to so many funerals where I never heard that story about that person. I didn't know that person felt that way about them. Oh, I didn't know that part of Dad's journey. I'm just learning it now. The more we can kind of take the concept of the stuff that happens at a funeral and have it in life, I think we'll all be better off for it, particularly Australians, particularly Australian men actually, who aren't great at sharing their emotions. We kind of reserve it all for this funeral when that person is gone. Just do it beforehand. You know, you're saying stuff and revealing feelings and sharing reflections that you've only done at the funeral. You've probably left it too late. And so do as much as you can beforehand. And the same is true on both sides, right? Like, it's, for me, the individual who's passed, like, you know, those who've got folks around them, whether they're old, young, well, or unhealthy, do it now. Because I think one thing I've learned through this journey is tomorrow's not promised. Share it today, because you don't know what the next day is going to bring.
Today, what is to you would be the perfect send-off for you personally?
It's funny, I've had a podcast myself where I've interviewed famous Australians about, like, I've asked them to reflect on their life by planning for their death. And as I've gone through that, I've been trying to do my own. It's shockingly boring for a funeral business owner. Like, I am a relatively private person. I don't necessarily have any extravagant stuff. And so I just love everybody to gather. My parents have a property in the foothills of Perth, just a barbecue, cricket in the backyard, music, a few beers, and sharing stories. That's the send-off for me. Kale's is a lot more extravagant. I'm jealous of when he does these interviews, because his is much cooler than mine.
Well, they do say that dying is the most private thing you can go through, but death is public.
Totally.
A big thank you to Sam McConkey from Bear Funerals for sharing his story and wisdom, and Barbara Sullivan, our dedicated interviewer. Before we go, I usually finish with a story that's quirky or unexpected, but this episode is different. During Passing Thoughts' summer hiatus, Sydney's iconic Bondi Beach was the site of Australia's deadliest terror attack. Much has already been written and said about the horror of that day. As a proud Jewish Australian, it hit me deeply and personally. So this episode is dedicated to the victims of the Bondi terror attack. I want to reflect on the words of Rabbi Ullman, whose son-in-law was amongst those killed. Even in the depths of his grief, said the following:
The darkness is not defeated by anger or force. Darkness is transformed by light. And that light begins with what each of us chooses to do next. And returning to normal is not enough. Sydney can and must become a beacon of goodness. A city where people look out for one another, where kindness is louder than hate, where decency is stronger than fear. And we can make it happen.
Passing Thoughts is made with the support of the Wicking Trust and the team from Radio 2 RPH, with special thanks to Marty, Veronica, and the station manager Barry. And just a reminder, we'd love to hear from you. If you have feedback, topic suggestions, or if you want to share your own experiences, email us at passingthoughts@2rph.org.au. Don't forget to rate and review Passing Thoughts, as it really helps others find the show. From 2RPH, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Kaldor.
This is a Radio 2 RPH production.